Before we ever talk about Bitcoin, before we mention cryptography, mining, or digital scarcity, we need to step back and look at something more fundamental. We need to look at how humans behave when their interests collide. Because whether we realize it or not, most of our lives are spent inside invisible games. A game, in the sense of game theory, is not about fun. It is about choices. It is about decisions made under uncertainty, where every player is trying to maximize their own outcome while reacting to the actions of others. Sometimes players cooperate, sometimes they betray each other, and most of the time they do both, depending on what the rules reward. Money, from its very beginning, has always been one of the most important games humans ever invented. It sits at the center of trust, power, and survival. It answers questions that are deeply psychological. Who do we trust? Who sets the rules? Who benefits when the rules change? For most of history, money worked because people believed in it. Gold had value because it was scarce and hard to fake. Paper money worked because it was redeemable. Modern fiat currencies work because governments say they do, and because everyone else accepts that claim. This belief system, however, is not neutral. It is shaped by incentives. In the current monetary game, there are players with very different levels of power. Central banks, governments, commercial banks, corporations, and ordinary individuals do not sit at the same table. They do not play by the same constraints. When crises happen, some players are rescued while others are told to endure. When money is printed, the effects ripple unevenly through society. Game theory helps us understand that this is not necessarily the result of evil intentions. It is the result of incentives. If you give a group the power to create money at near zero cost and you reward them for short-term stability or political survival, they will act accordingly. Inflation, currency debasement, and asset bubbles are not bugs in the system. They are rational outcomes of the rules. From the perspective of an individual citizen, this creates a frustrating paradox. You are expected to trust the system, save in the currency, and play by the rules. But you also know, intuitively or through experience, that the rules can change. Interest rates can be manipulated. Savings can lose value. Entire lifetimes of work can be diluted quietly without a single law being broken. This is what game theorists would call an asymmetrical game. One side has optionality and flexibility. The other has exposure and obligation. And when trust erodes in such a game, people begin to look for alternatives, not out of rebellion, but out of self-preservation. Bitcoin did not appear in a vacuum. It emerged in the aftermath of a global financial crisis that exposed the fragile nature of trust-based systems. But more importantly, it emerged as a response to a deeper question. What if we could design a monetary game where the rules could not be changed by the players themselves? This is where Bitcoin becomes interesting, not as technology, but as game design. Instead of asking people to trust institutions, Bitcoin asks them to verify rules. Instead of relying on human discretion, it relies on economic incentives enforced by code. It does not assume that participants are honest or altruistic. It assumes the opposite. It assumes that people are rational, self-interested, and willing to exploit weaknesses if doing so benefits them. In traditional systems, this assumption is dangerous. In Bitcoin, it is foundational. The brilliance of Bitcoin lies in its refusal to moralize human behavior. It does not ask miners to be good. It asks them to be rational. It does not ask users to believe in a leader or a promise. It asks them to follow rules that apply equally to everyone. Game theory teaches us that the most stable systems are not those that rely on trust, but those where cheating is either impossible or unprofitable. Bitcoin aims for the latter. It creates a game where following the rules is the most rewarding strategy, and breaking them is economically self-destructive. This idea represents a quiet but radical shift. For the first time, money is no longer a narrative enforced by authority. It is a protocol enforced by incentives. No one needs to be in charge. No one needs to be trusted. The game runs itself. As we move deeper into this topic, it becomes clear that Bitcoin is not trying to overthrow the existing system through force or ideology. It is offering a parallel game, a game where anyone can join, anyone can leave, and no one can change the rules once they are set. And that raises a powerful question. If money is a game and games shape behavior, what happens when you change the rules so that honesty becomes the most selfish choice? That is the question Bitcoin poses to the world. And to understand the answer, we need to look closely at how this game actually works and why. Paradoxically, it succeeds precisely because it does not trust anyone at all. One of the most common misunderstandings about Bitcoin is the belief that it works because people cooperate, that miners agree to play fair, that node operators act responsibly, that users behave ethically. In reality, Bitcoin survives precisely because it expects none of that. Bitcoin is built on a far more realistic assumption. Every participant is acting in their own self-interest. They want profit. They want security. They want control over their own resources. And if given the chance to cheat without consequences, many of them would. Game theory does not judge this behavior. It studies it. In most systems, self-interest is something designers try to suppress with rules, laws, and punishments. Bitcoin takes a different approach. It aligns self-interest with system integrity so tightly that betraying the network becomes irrational. To understand this, imagine the role of a Bitcoin miner. On the surface, mining looks like a technical process, but beneath that, it is a competitive economic game. Miners invest real capital into hardware and electricity. They compete with each other to add the next block to the chain. The reward for winning is tangible and immediate. Now consider the miner's options. They can follow the protocol, validate transactions honestly, and attempt to extend the longest valid chain. Or they can attempt to cheat by altering transaction history, double spending, or producing invalid blocks. Game theory asks a simple question: which strategy yields the highest expected payoff? The answer, almost always, is honesty. Cheating in Bitcoin is not forbidden by a moral code. It is punished by mathematics and economics. An invalid block is rejected by the network. A dishonest chain is ignored. The electricity and hardware costs spent on that attempt are lost forever. Worse still, successful attacks require massive sustained expenditure, and even if they succeed briefly, they destroy the very asset the attacker is trying to exploit. This creates a powerful equilibrium. In game theory terms, Bitcoin pushes participants toward a stable strategy where deviation is costly and cooperation emerges naturally without trust. What makes this remarkable is that cooperation in Bitcoin is not emotional or social. Miners do not know each other. They do not need to communicate. They do not care about the ideological purity of the system. They cooperate because the protocol makes cooperation profitable. This is what people mean when they say Bitcoin is trustless. It does not mean trust is absent. It means trust is unnecessary. The same logic extends beyond miners. Full node operators independently verify the rules. They do not need to trust miners to behave. They verify every block themselves. If miners try to change the rules, nodes simply reject those changes. Power is distributed not through persuasion, but through verification. Game theory reveals something subtle here. In Bitcoin, power is fragmented in a way that prevents any single group from dominating without enormous cost. Miners have power, but only as long as they follow rules enforced by nodes. Developers can propose changes, but they cannot force adoption. Users can choose which software to run. Every role checks the others. This structure resembles a repeated game, played over an indefinite time horizon. In such games, long-term incentives dominate short-term gains. Destroying the system for a one-time benefit is irrational when your future profits depend on the system's continued credibility. Even the famous 51% attack is often misunderstood in this context. While technically possible, it is economically self-defeating in most realistic scenarios. An attacker capable of controlling the majority of the network's computing power has invested enormous resources. Undermining trust in Bitcoin would directly devalue the attacker's own holdings and equipment. Game theory does not say attacks are impossible. It says they are unlikely because they do not align with rational self-interest under current conditions. Bitcoin's design transforms adversaries into guardians. The people most capable of attacking the network are the ones most financially exposed to its failure. This inversion is not accidental. It is deliberate game design. Contrast this with traditional financial systems, where those who can take the biggest risks often suffer the least consequences. Losses are socialized. Gains are privatized. The incentive structure encourages reckless behavior precisely because the downside is cushioned. Bitcoin removes that safety net. There are no bailouts, no central authority to reverse mistakes. Every participant bears the full consequences of their actions. From a game theory perspective, this dramatically changes behavior. When actions have irreversible outcomes, players become more cautious. When rules are predictable, players adapt long-term strategies. When cheating is expensive, honesty becomes the dominant strategy. This is why Bitcoin has survived for over a decade in a hostile environment. It has been attacked, criticized, and declared dead countless times. Yet the game continues, block after block, not because participants are idealists, but because the system rewards those who act in ways that sustain it. Bitcoin does not eliminate human greed, it harnesses it. And as this game grows, attracting more players with different motivations and time horizons, the dynamics become even more fascinating. Because once individuals, institutions, and eventually nations enter the same game, the strategies evolve. In the next part, we will explore how this game expands beyond miners and early adopters, and how network effects and strategic positioning turn Bitcoin into a long-term coordination game on a global scale. Up to this point, Bitcoin might still appear to be a game played by a relatively small group of participants. Miners compete for block rewards, developers debate code changes, early users speculate on price. But game theory tells us that the most interesting phase of any system begins when new types of players enter and are forced to adapt their strategies. Bitcoin's game does not stay small. It scales. As more people become aware of Bitcoin, they are faced with a choice that is both financial and strategic. They can ignore it, they can oppose it, or they can participate. Each choice carries different risks, and more importantly, different opportunity costs. For an individual, buying Bitcoin early is a high-risk move. There is uncertainty, volatility, and social skepticism, but early participants are compensated with disproportionate upside. They are not rewarded for being smarter, but for being earlier. In game theory terms, they accept higher uncertainty in exchange for greater potential payoff. Late participants face a different game. The risks are lower, but so are the rewards. The network is more secure, the narrative is clearer, the asset is more liquid, but the opportunity to accumulate at low cost has passed. This creates a natural incentive gradient that pulls adoption forward over time. What makes this dynamic powerful is that it does not require coordination. No one needs to convince the next participant to join. The system's growing credibility does the work. Each new user indirectly increases the value of the network for everyone else. This is the essence of a network effect, but framed as a strategic game rather than a marketing phenomenon. Businesses experience this shift in a different way. At first, accepting Bitcoin seems unnecessary, even risky. Accounting is unclear. Regulation is uncertain, demand is small. But as more users hold Bitcoin, and as infrastructure improves, refusing to engage becomes a strategic disadvantage. Companies that adapt early gain experience, liquidity, and reputation. Those that wait may survive, but they follow rather than lead. Game theory describes this as a coordination problem. Once a critical mass is reached, the optimal strategy changes. What was once optional becomes rational. What was once risky becomes conservative. The most dramatic shift occurs when institutions enter the game. For hedge funds, pension funds, and publicly traded companies, Bitcoin is not just an asset. It is a hedge against a system they are deeply exposed to. Holding Bitcoin becomes a way to reduce long-term risk, even if short-term volatility remains. Here, the game changes again. When large players allocate capital, they signal legitimacy. Their participation alters the payoff matrix for everyone else. Regulators take notice. Governments begin to ask different questions. Not is Bitcoin a scam, but what happens if we are late? This is where the game extends beyond markets and into geopolitics. Nations face a uniquely complex decision. They cannot simply speculate. Their actions influence monetary policy, capital flows, and international relations. Some countries attempt to ban Bitcoin, hoping to preserve control. Others quietly accumulate or experiment, hedging their bets. From a game theory perspective, this resembles a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma played on a global scale. If no country adopts Bitcoin, the status quo remains. If some adopt and others do not, the adopters may gain strategic advantages. If many adopt, those who resisted may find themselves disadvantaged in a new monetary landscape. What makes this dilemma unstable is time. Bitcoin does not pause, blocks continue to be mined. Adoption, even if slow, compounds. The cost of waiting is invisible at first, but grows over time. A country that dismisses Bitcoin today may face a much higher entry cost a decade later. Importantly, Bitcoin does not require permission to win this game. It does not lobby governments or negotiate treaties. It simply exists as an option. And in game theory, the existence of a credible alternative changes behavior, even if it is not immediately chosen. Citizens in unstable economies already understand this intuitively. When trust in local currency erodes, Bitcoin becomes not an investment, but an escape hatch. A parallel system that cannot be inflated, frozen, or easily confiscated. Each person who chooses that option weakens the old game slightly and strengthens the new one. This creates a feedback loop. As Bitcoin proves useful in extreme conditions, its narrative spreads. As its narrative spreads, its legitimacy grows. As legitimacy grows, more conservative players feel safe entering. Each cycle reinforces the next. What is fascinating is that no central planner orchestrates this expansion. There is no roadmap for global adoption. The game evolves organically, shaped by incentives, fear, greed, and survival. Game theory helps us see why opposition often accelerates this process. Attempts to suppress Bitcoin signal its perceived threat. Restrictions create curiosity. Bans validate its usefulness as a censorship-resistant asset. Every move against it becomes part of the game, altering strategies in unintended ways. At this stage, Bitcoin begins to resemble something more than money. It becomes a coordination layer, a shared reference point for value across borders, ideologies, and systems. Not because everyone agrees on what Bitcoin is, but because everyone understands what it does. And once a system reaches that level of strategic importance, the game no longer revolves around short-term price movements. It becomes about positioning for a future that is uncertain, but increasingly difficult to ignore. In the final part, we will step back and look at this game from a long-term perspective. What happens when the rewards shrink, the system matures, and the players are no longer early or late, but simply inside a game that cannot be stopped? Every game changes as it matures. Early chaos gives way to structure. Wild incentives slowly compress into narrower margins. Bitcoin is no exception. But what makes this game unique is that its end state was anticipated from the very beginning. As Bitcoin moves forward in time, the most obvious change is the shrinking block reward. Every 4 years, the subsidy paid to miners is cut in half. Eventually, new Bitcoin issuance will approach zero. To many observers, this looks like a flaw. A system that pays less to secure itself appears fragile. Game theory suggests the opposite. In the early stages, high rewards attract players willing to take significant risks. They bootstrap the network. They absorb volatility. As the system grows stronger and more valuable, it requires fewer subsidies to remain secure. Transaction fees gradually replace block rewards, shifting incentives from expansion to maintenance. This transition is not abrupt. It is stretched across decades, allowing strategies to evolve. Miners adapt their business models. Efficiency becomes more important than brute force. Long-term profitability replaces short-term speculation. The game slows down, but it does not weaken. What matters in game theory is not constant growth, but sustainable equilibrium. Bitcoin's design aims for a state where securing the network remains profitable, not because of inflation, but because users are willing to pay for an incorruptible settlement layer. At this stage, Bitcoin resembles critical infrastructure more than a startup. Its value is no longer derived from novelty, but from reliability. Attacking it becomes harder not only technically, but economically and politically. The number of players with a stake in its survival grows too large. This is where Bitcoin's time horizon reveals its deepest strength. Most systems are optimized for short-term outcomes. Political cycles, quarterly earnings, and election timelines shape decisions. Bitcoin operates on a different clock. Its rules do not respond to crises, headlines, or pressure. They remain indifferent. Game theory tells us that in repeated games with no final round, strategies that favor stability outperform those that chase immediate advantage. Bitcoin embodies this principle in code. It does not promise flexibility. It promises predictability. Critics often argue that Bitcoin is inefficient, slow, or rigid. From a narrow technical perspective, that may be true. But from a game theoretic perspective, rigidity is a feature. It limits the ability of powerful players to change the rules when it suits them. It protects the small player from arbitrary shifts. Over time, this changes behavior. People stop expecting bailouts. They stop assuming mistakes will be reversed. Responsibility becomes personal again. In a world accustomed to moral hazard, this is deeply uncomfortable. But it is also deeply stabilizing. Bitcoin does not claim to solve inequality, corruption, or human conflict. It does something far more modest and far more difficult. It removes money from the realm of negotiation. It turns it into a constant like gravity. You can build on top of it, but you cannot vote it away. As this game continues, participation becomes less about belief and more about pragmatism. People do not need to love Bitcoin. They only need to recognize that opting out has a cost. Just as ignoring the internet eventually became impractical, ignoring a neutral global monetary network may become strategically unwise. This does not mean Bitcoin replaces everything. Game theory rarely results in total domination. It results in coexistence. Old systems persist, but their monopoly fades. New systems emerge, not through force, but through superior incentive alignment. Perhaps the most profound shift Bitcoin introduces is psychological. It teaches a generation to think in long-time horizons, to value scarcity in a world of abundance, to understand that rules matter more than rulers. In the end, Bitcoin is not a bet on technology. It is a bet on human nature, a recognition that people will always pursue their own interest, and that the best systems are those that channel that pursuit toward outcomes that benefit everyone involved. If the world is a game, then Bitcoin is not the final move. It is a new set of rules. Rules that no one controls, no one can easily change, and everyone is free to play. The question it leaves us with is not whether Bitcoin will succeed or fail. The question is simpler and far more personal. In a game that may last longer than any institution you trust today, which rules do you want to play by?